Well, the message of the book is you have to really think more closely about corporate governance. You just can't do a checklist, can't just rely on blue ribbon panel recommendations. You actually have to look at it in a deep way. What's the research telling us? And you really have to think harder about it as opposed to some of the simple solutions that we've seen so far in companies and in the world.
Yeah, I think the message of the book is that the context really matters. When you look at what works or does not work for an organization, you can't apply a one-size-fits-all solution. You really need to look at what the situation of the company is, what its strategy is, who the players are involved, and what they're trying to accomplish before you come up with a solution.
Yeah, I think it's harder work than what people think it is. Well, I think we'd like to shift the focus away from these checklist sorts of governance assessments into something where it's based on research, what do we really know, and bring that together to hopefully improve corporate governance in companies, not only in the U.S. but around the world.
I think with the book we'd like to really reach the practitioners so that the people who are actually making decisions have the information they need to make the decisions they need to make. I think if we could have a real world impact that's based on evidence and facts, that would be very positive for us.
As I was teaching a course in corporate governance, and there really wasn't much material, either cases or professional readings that really worked. There's a lot of academic research, but it's a little above the types of assignments that we typically give MBA students. So part of the reason was we wanted some teaching material. The other part of it is when we actually looked at the governance books that were out there, they were very legalistic in orientation, and we thought that the legal system is obviously a key part of corporate governance, but it's maybe the first step. The parts above that are what's really key. Once you satisfy your legal duties, how do you want to structure the board? How do you want to think about risk management? What should you do if you're confronted with an activist? And there's lots of research around that. And what we try to do is synthesize that such that we'd have something that was useful for teaching. But as we got into it, we realized that there was a need for such a book, that would be used in boardrooms, among consultants, lawyers, etc.
I think we saw an opportunity to bring together both professional data and academic research and real-life examples to blend it together in a format that people could really learn from. As Dave said, a lot of the books out there are really opinion-based. A lot of them are written by lawyers and from a legal perspective, but they don't have a lot of supporting information that helps you really understand what the trade-offs are of the decisions you're making. And I think we saw the opportunity to bring data together with real-world examples to help you make those conclusions.
Yeah, we thought it was a good idea, particularly here at Stanford, to blend what we know from the law school with what we do in the business school. So that's a really exciting part of it as well. Again, there's books that are written from one perspective or another. We're trying to bridge that gap, and a little bit try to take the best out of both these worlds. But one of the key things we try to do with the book is be true to what is the research telling us if it exists. And we wanted to bring that forward. I think a lot of the academic research is just not put into a package where it's accessible by lots of professionals. And so, again, as Brian said, we've got some good examples that illustrate these points. We've interviewed lots of people. We've obviously written a lot of cases and analyses around these things. So we were able to blend this together into, we think, what's a pretty interesting book.
And I think this book is different in the standpoint that if there are conclusions that cannot be made based on the evidence, we frankly say that. The evidence is not conclusive in this area that you should do one thing or the other, and I don't think we have any problem saying that if that's what the evidence suggests.
Kind of examples in the book, we sort of kick off the book using the example of HealthSouth, which is obviously a gigantic company, a favorite of Wall Street. They ran into some pretty serious governance problems. The board really wasn't meeting very often. The company was controlled by the kind of founding CEO and things like that. And we tracked that through as a kickoff example. Here's what kind of bad governance looks like. I think that's a pretty good example of all the things that impinge on governance, including the board, institutional shareholders, what the CFOs are doing, and things like that. So I think that's a good example about what kind of, let's say, inappropriate governance looks like. We have lots of examples in the book with regard to compensation programs, new changes that are being put into place, things like, how are companies actually trying to determine what excessive risk-taking looks like? And we have lots of examples of that, of those kinds of things. And we kind of conclude the book a little bit in terms of, well, there are obviously alternative models for governance, and one of those is kind of the Berkshire Hathaway model, which is one that is based more on trust. The senior executives they're going to trust the board and vice versa, as opposed to very stringent sort of rules and monitoring that goes on in a traditional governance setting. So we have lots of examples scattered throughout the book, and I think virtually all the key points are illustrated like this.
I think some of the best examples are in the board structure chapter, the chapter 5, which talks about the different aspects of how to compile a board and what the evidence says about what works and what doesn't work. And as Dave says, there are both confirming and disconfirming examples that I think really help people understand the nuances of these decisions. So for example, there's a lot of support these days for the idea that the chairman of the board should be independent. That person should not be the CEO and should be a separate person. And there are examples in the book from, say, General Motors right after their bankruptcy, where they tried to adopt this model, but it effectively either failed or backfired on them, and they ended up consolidating the roles. There's also an example of Bank of America trying to do the same thing as well, and some of the problems that come with that.
We're starting to get lots of inquiries from the press wanting copies of the book for review. There's professional magazines are running excerpts of certain chapters, and they're also reviewing the book. We've gotten a lot of response, although it's a little unfair from kind of people that we know on boards. I mean, and so a number of boards, one of the members that we might know has purchased the book for the entire board and things like that.
Well, I think the response has been very favorable from a wide variety of constituents, and that's exactly what we wanted to see. People who are on boards have been very thankful, and in fact, that we looked at these issues from a standpoint that would be favorable for them. That's unbiased and that's objective. That talks about the positives and the negatives of different decisions. We've also gotten positive response from academics who've said that this is a very refreshing fact-based book. And then finally, we've gotten positive response from institutional investors who are looking at these same issues, but from the other side of the table. I think there are two things that are next. What's next is we're interested in looking at the positive examples. A lot of this book obviously talks about scandals and downsides and failures and things like that, but we're really interested in what makes organizations better. And so our next projects will probably continue to focus on what makes governance better and not just what prevents the bad stuff from happening. I think the second thing is to move into, and related to that, that moves into more organizational factors and how they influence governance. I mean, looking more at the CEO and the decisions of the CEO and how that improves or impairs decisions, looking more at the board and how you can actually get a qualified board together, someone who's qualified and engaged, and also looking at organizational factors that influence governance. Yeah,
the what's next is always the key question. One of the things that we're looking at is this whole industry, which I'll refer to as a proxy advisory industry, and so include companies like Institutional Shareholder Services, Glass Lewis, and other companies that provide voting recommendations to institutional holders with regard to how they should vote on the board, how they should vote on things like compensation programs and things like that. There are obviously big tastemakers out there. I think their role is actually not that well understood. And one of the things we're looking at in kind of an expanded form is, are these companies actually are these companies actually making recommendations that are consistent with increasing shareholder value? So I think this is something that I think is going to be an exciting thing to look at. We're also taking a look at some alternative forms of governance. I mentioned earlier about trust in organizations. How does trust actually play into the design of governance systems and things like that? And so that's a focus. And another focus, as Brian just talked about, is it's easy to find governance disasters in the press. I mean, they're picked up. There's lots of enthusiasm around these things. It's harder to find good governance or excellent governance where the governance of the organization kicked in some form and stopped something bad that could have happened and could have been devastating. So one of the things that we're looking at is, instead of just railing on, here's bad things that occurred, what are some of the good things? What are some good examples? We obviously believe that most companies, most board members, executives are trying to do the right thing, but it's a tough job. But we're interested in what kind of structures actually work in what kind of settings. And again, the bad ones are easy to find. The good ones are not that easy to find because they don't make that much of a fun reading in the newspaper.
And no matter what we do, we're going to make sure that it's based on data and evidence. I think that's a key thing that won't change going forward. All the topics that Dave talked about, there needs to be some concrete evidence about how they work, positive or negative in each of those areas. So I think that's going to continue to be a focus.